Hei sann alle sammen, og velkommen til månedens møte med Morten. Jeg heter da Morten Hestein-Låsius, og jeg er nestleder i Palestina-komiteen i Bergen, og har da startet disse månedlige møtene. Men i dag så skal vi ha et møte som handler om CoVid i Palestina, og da har vi fått med oss tre palestinske leger, og folk som jobber med helse og forskning på helse. Og så har vi med oss Mads Gilbert. Men for at, av respekt for dem, så skal jeg nå skifte til engelsk, og resten av møtet kommer til å foregå på engelsk. Jeg ber alle sammen om å bruke kommentarfeltet til spørsmål, dersom dere må ha det, og still gjerne mange spørsmål. Det er veldig kjekt. Okay, so in English now for our Palestinian friends. So welcome to this third edition of the monthly meeting with Morten, a meeting aiming to educate us about the current situation and current events and themes that are lifted in the media or that are ongoing in Palestine. So far we've talked about political tensions in Palestine, and the last meeting was about BDS, boycott, divestments and sanctions. And this month, we will learn more about the COVID situation in Palestine. Now, we've all experienced a year in the sign of the pandemic, with lockdowns, with fears about the virus and social isolation. But here in Norway, we are living our lives in complete freedom. However, in Palestine, the population, the health system, and the health professionals have to tackle the virus while living under a brutal Israeli occupation, lasting almost 54 years, and in Gaza they also have to tackle an airtight blockade lasting close to 14 years, and the devastations of an endless stream of Israeli military attacks. I'm really looking forward to this meeting. Too often we are told news from Palestine told by Norwegian or European voices, but today I have the honor of presenting three Palestinian voices, each with their unique experiences and knowledge about the situation in Palestine concerning COVID. So I'll bring them all in now. Unfortunately, Yara Asi will be joining us a bit later, but she will be joining us in 10 minutes. So I'll bring you all in. So Dr. Ahmed El-Darawi is a general practitioner working in the European Gaza Hospital, which is one of the main COVID hospitals in Gaza. He will tell us about the situation in Gaza now, about his work in the hospital, and his experiences working with patients and against the virus in Gaza. So very nice to have you with us, Ahmed.
It's an honor to me, Morten.
We also have Dr. Anas Ismail is a doctor who studied and trained in Gaza, and he is now studying global health in the UK. So he will talk about the situation in the health system in Gaza after living under occupation and blockade for nearly 14 years. So very nice to have you with us, Anas.
Thank you, Morten, for having us and for organizing this meeting.
Also joining us later is Dr. Yara Asi. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Central Florida, teaching in the Department of Health Management and Informatics, and she is also a contributor to the Palestinian think tank Al-Shabaka. So she will tell us about the situation on the occupied West Bank. And then we have Dr. Mads Gilbert, who needs no introduction to us Norwegians, but he will get one all the same. He is a Norwegian doctor of anesthesiology at the University Hospital of Northern Norway, and a long-standing solidarity worker for the Palestinian people with a special love for Gaza. So he will talk about some of the political issues of the occupation in relation to the COVID epidemic. So very nice to have you with us, Mats.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and congratulations to the Palestine Committee for having this historical meeting where the majority of the speakers are Palestinians. And that's very good. Shukran jazilan.
Okay, so we will start with Ahmed, and after each talk we will lift like one or two questions from the comments field to answer. So I hope you will use the comments field to ask your questions, and then in the end, if we have time, we'll raise some more questions as a discussion. So without further ado, I'll thank all our speakers for taking the time to share their knowledge with us, and I will give the word to you, Ahmed.
First of all, I want to thank you, Morten, for this great opportunity and for your great continuous supporting for the Palestinians. It is my pleasure to be here talking about COVID-19 situation in Gaza and the work we are trying to do here. As you know, COVID-19 started, the first case were diagnosed in March 2020 in the Rafah cross-border in quarantine centers, where actually it's not a quarantine center, it's a school turned to a quarantine center. So the preparation we have to do started on March. On March. Started with education the people, increase their level, their knowledge about the virus, about the social isolation, about exactly not that we educated them well, but calm them down and convince them there is a virus, there is a pandemic came to us, and starting to prepare the hospitals for the virus. So we started to move to turn the Robi hospital, one of the biggest hospitals in Gaza. Actually, one of the two biggest hospitals. We don't have a large hospitals in Gaza except Robi and Ashifa. So we started to turn the Robi hospital for a COVID hospital. And there is a really hard time to do this job, because actually we don't have enough beds in the hospital. We are talking about a total of 63 ICU beds on all the Gaza Strip. So we needed a ventilators, a PPE, a lot of drugs from the outside, and to get a ventilator, to get supplies from the outside the Gaza Strip takes a long time. So we started with a 16-bed ICU bed in Robi Hospital, because we only have 16 ventilators. The oxygen station for the hospital was only giving 1,200 liter per minute oxygen, which is very little. So, and until March 2020 to August, from March 2020 to August 2020, all the cases were diagnosed with COVID were in the quarantine center. In the end of August, 26 August 2020, the first case outside the quarantine were diagnosed, and the panic started in Gaza. The people were hurrying for food, ensure food, and where there was a mess. In the hospital, the number increased rapidly. The cases of COVID increased very rapidly. After 3 weeks, from 26 August to 20 September, all the beds in the European hospital were occupied. 400 beds were occupied and were registered for 420 cases in the hospital, despite there is only 400 beds in the hospital, and the ICU were full. I'm working in ICU now, and we suffered from the oxygen demand. The oxygen bar were suddenly dropping. All the patients in ICU desaturated, and really were nothing to do until waiting for the new oxygen station, new ventilators, and there is a shortage of medical staff. I work in ICU, but I am a GB. I got my medical license 2 months before I started work in ICU unit. So there is a very shortage in ventilators and medical staff. And the Minister of Health surprisingly did a new hiring job, two exams hiring job for doctors. We all worked for 3 months in ICU and in COVID hospitals without any payments. It really didn't matter for me if I got paid or not, but some other colleagues were in need for the money. But we have to face the situation, and the people here were in miserable situation. First, you talking about social isolation when the pandemic started, but Gaza is densely populated area, especially in refugee camps. So social isolation was like a joke for him. They can't, obviously, and the lockdown started, but people here, the main population here working in a daily jobs. So if they couldn't work today, they won't have anything to eat. Really, it was a miserable situation. 2 months ago, new ventilators came to the hospital, arrived to the hospital. The ventilators, we asked the government and Israeli authorities to allow to enter Gaza maybe 6 months ago, entered in 2 months, before 2 months, and the situation really got better. The mortality rate decreased, and now we are in a little relief. But I want to talk on another suffer, the cancer patients who suffer from refuse to get permits to Israeli referral. The referral were allowed, about 2,000 patients were allowed to get to Israel to get treated there, but in May the numbers decreased by half. Only 900 patients allowed to go to Israel to get radiotherapy, chemotherapy, because we don't have radiotherapy or chemotherapy here in Gaza, and the situation got really bad for them. Another problem I have seen, I worked 1 month in ER during COVID crisis. One thing I have seen, really, the violence rate were really high, increased spectacularly due to the school closed, the mosque closed, so the children here who don't have any places to go, stuck at their houses with their parents. And as we already live in a stressed lifestyle, so the violence rate got up high because the school were the only places kids here were having fun, and suddenly they all in their houses with their parents. And I don't mean they have a bad parents, but they're you can't
Thank you, Ahmed. Sorry, I had my mic muted. So we have a question from the comments field, and it's Dagfinn Nyborg who's asking, how are the schools and the university in Gaza functioning now? And he's from
Right now,
the twin town of Khan Yunis, he wants to say as well.
now the university and school almost got regular in the normal days, except for the Saturday. There is a lockdown, and the Friday it's a vacation anyway, a lockdown. Otherwise, all okay, all normal now. because we have really decreasing in the cases, and people started to live a normal life.
I'm glad to hear that the cases are resounding and things are getting better.
Wait.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. I think we'll take you out and bring Anas in, and we'll take you back in the end. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Anas. So you will be talking a little bit about the situation for the health system in Gaza, right?
Yes, I'll be kind of trying to draw a bigger over which the pandemic has occurred in the Gaza Strip as kind of a special case. So when we think of the pandemic in the Gaza Strip, I believe that we have to think of it in the general background or the general picture under which the Gaza Strip lives. So, which is the siege or the blockade that has been imposed on the Gaza Strip for the past 14 years. So I think we should think of the pandemic is like an element or a piece of the chain of the events, the sad and deteriorating events for the health system over the past 14 years. So if you go back in 2006, after the parliamentary election that happened in the Palestinian territories and the one of Hamas government, and we see that from then right on, the economic sanctions and political siege started, which obviously affected. I still remember it, even when I was still a child. But I remember the hard economic sanctions and the hard economic conditions that we lived in back then. And then we move on to July 27, 2007, when the siege actually started and the blockade started by the Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip. And since then, all that exits Gaza, all that enters Gaza is extremely and meticulously controlled by the authorities, the occupying authorities. So we're not really in control of what we need, what we want, when we don't have really much freedom of movement. Even if we need supplies, we need equipment, we need even personnel to go out and train. It's out of our control, and so we have to look at the COVID-19 in that picture or in that reality. And so, with the start of the blockade in July 2007, and then you move on for 1 year at the end of 2008, when we have the first Operation Cast Lead in December 2008, which killed nearly 1,400 people. 16 of them were health personnel. We had hospitals that were damaged. We have tens of thousands of housing units that were either damaged or completely or partially. And then after that, we had a slow and agonizing stage of reconstruction. Of course, going back to the idea of not having the ability to control what comes in and what comes out, you have this stage of reconstruction in which we need to rebuild what was destroyed during the attacks, but we're not really in control of what we need. So we can't. So the process becomes very slow and very agonizing with the meticulous security permits and scrutiny of the occupation and the blockade. And then you go on 4 years later in 2012, where you have still another attack, Operation Pillar of Defense. And then after the attack, you have again the slow rebuilding and agonizing, the rebuilding process. And during the attacks, of course, there is much destruction to the infrastructure, to the housing units, to the health facilities, and the killing and injuring of the civilians in the Gaza Strip. And then you go on nearly 1 year and a half after that, and you have Operation Protective Edge, which lasted for 51 years, for 51 days, sorry, in which nearly 2,200 people were killed, more than 11,000 people were injured, 500,000 of the population in Gaza. So you're talking about the quarter of the population in Gaza were displaced. And if you think about displacement in Gaza, you think about how overcrowding, how small Gaza is, and you think about how the quarter of the population is forced to be displaced. You can think of it in terms of overcrowding, in terms of bad living conditions, and in terms of deteriorating health conditions, in addition to the bombing and the killing that is going on. And then after that, you still have again the process of rebuilding that is also slow, that is agonizing, that is very, in a way, degrading to the populations of Gaza, who, you know, always need these permits, the security scrutiny, and those bureaucratic procedures in order to get the materials they need, basically, to live a normal life. And then after that, you have in 2018, in March, the beginning of the Great March of Return, which continued on a weekly basis for nearly 70 weeks or more than 70 weeks and ended towards the end of 2019. And during those protests, you have more than 25 people who were killed. You have more than 30,000 people who were injured, 8,000 of whom are injured by gunshots. And after 2019, when it ended and you're entering 2020, hoping that things probably will get better or the situation will improve, we will get a rest from all these events. But unfortunately, you get the pandemic that started with the first cases in Gaza in March. So really, when we think of the COVID-19 situation in Gaza, we shouldn't think of it as kind of like an isolated event where, compared with the rest of the world, you know, like you're operating on a routinely basis, doing the typical work, and then all of a sudden you have the pandemic with which you have to deal. But rather in the Gaza Strip, you just have a chain of events that, you know, make the population fatigue, make the healthcare system fatigue, really overstretch the health system beyond its limits, causes destruction and damage to the infrastructure, and this is all in the picture of continuous and airtight blockade. So this is, I think this is the picture, or this is kind of the lens through which we have to look at COVID-19 in the Gaza Strip. So if we focus more on the health system in the Gaza Strip and how the siege has impacted to that, I would continue on 2 points that my friend Dr. Ahmed just mentioned. And one of them is that the need for the equipment and the PPEs and other medical equipments that we know are extremely important and essential in the fight for COVID and improving the survival and decreasing the mortality of the patients. And so we know that you need ICU beds, you need ventilators, you need a lot of PPE, continuous supplies for these disposables. You need a lot of high capacity to produce therapeutic oxygen for the patients. And so going back to the point that you're living in a place where you absolutely have no control of obtaining these equipment and these health equipment, and you're just, even when you're making a request or they're being donated from some other donor, you have to go through the process of scrutinization of security permits, which would delay the arrival of these equipment. And so as Ahmed experienced in the hospital, where, you know, they would request or they would need the equipment at a particular time, but due to these security apparatus, bureaucratics, and those delays, you would receive them much later, which obviously would affect the work, would affect the mortality of the patients, and would affect the general status of the healthcare system. Not only is it in terms of the equipment and the disposables and all of that, but also when you think of it in terms of the structures and the infrastructure for the healthcare system. So when you look at in public health, when you're talking about or gauging the healthcare system of a society, one of the elements you should look at is the social determinants of the healthcare system over there. And then you look at that in Gaza Strip, you can see that there is poor infrastructure, there is obviously overcrowding of people, there is a health system that is characterized by severe shortages in beds per people, in medications, and health personnel, and other elements that adversely affect the healthcare system and the capacity of the healthcare system to work and function properly, especially in a pandemic. And so the conclusion that we reach when looking at the healthcare system in Gaza prior to the COVID-19 is that the ongoing siege for 14 years plus the repetitive attacks every few years has not only made the healthcare system incapable of handling such a tragedy or such a pandemic, but also it made it extremely hard for the people leading the healthcare system or trying to prepare the healthcare system for such a pandemic. It made their job extremely hard, or sometimes even impossible, when you stand helpless, knowing what you need, knowing what you need to do, but absolutely not being able to do that. Another element that relates to the healthcare system also is the point of referrals and the impact of the siege on that, and that is the siege as we said before and discussed, that it made it impossible sometimes to get equipment and therapeutics into Gaza, and one of those is radiotherapy for cancer patients, and of course other treatments for other conditions that people in Gaza suffer. And so sometimes you have to refer patients for outside because they need the care that is not present in Gaza. But in light of the siege and under that reality, this referral process becomes really hard, with even in conditions, in normal conditions that Gaza lived in before the COVID-19. You have, as reported by the WHO, that up to 55% of those patients are either delayed in their referrals or their applications are not accepted. And so when you go into even a worse situation under the COVID-19 and worsening referral policies, you have also patients who are not able to receive and access the care they need, and they are just waiting in Gaza basically to die. And we have to remember also that these patients, the cancer patients, patients with other chronic conditions that need care, patients or pediatric patients with complex cases, complex heart congenital anomalies or neurosurgical problems, they are also the populations that are most fragile, most highest risk populations when they are when they contract COVID, the COVID virus. And so it becomes a very complex situation, a situation that is hard to manage, a situation that is hard even to live for the population in Gaza. And a final element that I want to talk about is the mental health element, because mental health is really important. And when you've lived in the Gaza Strip, and you have generations, whole generations who lived completely under the siege, they've never seen anything other than Gaza, other than the siege, other than the bombing, other than the electricity shortages, other than the undrinkable water, other than the poor infrastructure for sewage, other than the fuel shortage. In addition, having to live under repetitive attacks. The aftermath or the product of all these factors is, of course, continuous or resistant psychological stress that the people live with. And when you talk about the COVID-19 and sometimes the restrictions that the public health experts have to do, such as social distancing, or sometimes taking harsh measures such as complete lockdowns, it becomes extremely hard for people in Gaza to live by these conditions, having to stay at home when your house is overcrowded, when you have 10 family members living in a small house with no electricity, with a shortage in drinking water. And so the life conditions and the mental health of people becomes a really important factor at play when deciding what to do or deciding the policies that you want to follow in order to mitigate the risks and to mitigate the circumstances of the COVID-19 and combat the disease. So I think, like in Gaza, the COVID-19, just as a conclusion, it's not just an isolated event that happened like the rest of the world, but it's more of one more element, unfortunately, one more negative element that is added to the complex mix of other negative elements at play that make the lives of the Gazans extremely hard.
I think listening to your description, we all understand that the difficulties of the situations that the health professionals experience and the population of Gaza experience. And we got one question. I was thinking I wanted to bring Ahmed back in because the question, Heidi Engum, she says, as a healthcare colleague, my heart bleeds for the conditions you work in and the hard choices you have to make. Do you have a good support system to help you all deal with the strain working at the hospital? Colleague support or similar? Is there even time for it?
Really, yes. As a junior, I have a support from my seniors in ICU who work in ICU, how to deal with patients psychologically and how to support them, and some techniques how to put a central line, chest tube, but the situation there is really bad. There is no local room for us, a 24-hour shift without a lunch, a dinner, but we get used to it.
Unfortunately, that's what you have to do, I guess. And Anas, how is it? Can you describe how it is to be abroad while this is going on in Gaza?
It's very stressing. It's very stressful for me to be abroad because I'm very afraid, of course, for my family, but equally to that, I'm very afraid and very sympathetic to my colleagues, such as Dr. Ahmed, who are working in the hospital, because I know a lot of them, and I know the situations under which they work and the low capacity with which they can work for factors that they have no control over. So this feeling of helplessness is really devastating when you're working in the medical field.
Okay, I think we'll say thank you for Gaza for now, and I mean I'm impressed by the work you guys do, and that you keep working, Ahmed. It seems like it's a hard work and difficult situation. So our hearts are with you, and we'll bring you back to the end of the meeting. Yeah. So now we will say hello to Yara Asi, who was not here in the beginning of the meeting because I gave her the wrong time and she had to be in another meeting. But I'm really happy that she could come back and join us. You will talk about the situation in the West Bank.
Yes.
So I'll remove myself and I'll give you all the space in the room.
Thank you, Morten, and thanks everyone for watching. You know, international solidarity on human rights issues is so important. So we really appreciate all your efforts, all your questions, all your advocacy. So I'm Dr. Yara Asi. I am originally from the West Bank, but I'm currently based in the States. So I thought to start my talk, I would first give a few general statistics just to put things in perspective. So throughout the Palestinian territories, the occupied Palestinian territories, the World Health Organization estimates just about 175,000 COVID cases total. About 163,000 have recovered, and about right under 2,000 Palestinians, again, between all the territories, have died. So, you know, the Palestinians were lucky initially because there were such strict lockdowns that throughout the spring and even into early summer, when the rest of the world was in the first wave, second wave, there were really very few cases throughout the territories, you know, because again, these are two environments, Gaza and the West Bank, that are very easy to lock down. Gaza, as I'm sure you've heard, has really one major entry exit point, two if you include Egypt. The West Bank similarly has one major entry exit point that Palestinians are allowed to use, which goes to Jordan, the King Hussein Bridge. There is an entry into Israel, but that's primarily for Palestinian day laborers who go to Israel for work and then re-enter the West Bank at night. So if you are able to block those few entry points, initially that was good in terms of COVID and an infectious disease like this. However, because the West Bank is more porous than Gaza, Gaza is of course under blockade, the West Bank did see COVID much, much earlier than Gaza. The West Bank had its first COVID cases in late March. It's believed that they were brought in from tourists who were vacationing in Bethlehem, which is a very popular tourist destination in the West Bank. And so, of course, once it was seen within the West Bank, then, the Bethlehem governorate was shut down, and then eventually the shutdown spread throughout the territory. But of course, with COVID, once it's in, then that's when the spread begins. So the first death in the West Bank was also much earlier than in the Gaza Strip. However, initially you really saw some understanding in the Palestinian population that with this infectious disease, you really needed to be under these lockdown conditions. And you saw initially 96% of Palestinians accepted these lockdown conditions. They're used to such conditions and checkpoints and border closures in previous times of conflict, especially during the first and second Intifada. So with this new scary infectious disease, they were quite accepting of the initial restrictions. Unfortunately, in the summer, as we started to learn more, we started to see community transmission increasing significantly. So then by July of 2020, you start seeing the case rate in the West Bank and Gaza Strip increasing significantly. And so as you see more cases, there started to be more deaths. However, at the same time, the Ministry of Health was warning that they were seeing large weddings again. People were traveling back into Israel for work again. People were visiting the mosque again. People were visiting their families. And in throughout the Palestinian territories and in the Middle East more broadly, families are quite large. So a family gathering, could be 50 people. So when you have these kinds of events, that's when you start seeing community transmission. And so it started to get quite bad in the late summer, and it's persistently gotten worse since. We're starting to see a decrease now in the winter months. So the pre-existing healthcare system in the West Bank, this is a topic I could talk about itself for an hour, but although different from Gaza and that Gaza is completely blockaded, the West Bank similarly has significant import restrictions for goods. That includes medical goods. And some medical goods are banned completely because Israel sees them as a security risk. It's also very difficult for healthcare personnel in Palestine to travel, to get training, for foreign healthcare workers to get into the West Bank, to do trainings, to do all the kinds of community building, conferences and activities that we see. The Palestinian Authority, is quite heavily dependent on foreign aid, and much of its budget is for security purposes. So you see very low public health funding. So unless you were fortunate enough to be able to afford private care or travel to Jordan or Egypt to get a healthcare need met, the public health system was already extremely poor due to the economy and the movement restrictions. So then when you have something like COVID that requires ICU beds, ventilators, swabs, syringes, PPE for healthcare workers, as my colleagues were just mentioning, this was very difficult for the territories, especially because it's important to remember that nothing enters the West Bank without Israel's approval. Even humanitarian aid has to be coordinated and approved through Israel, and generally it's sent to Tel Aviv before it is sent to Ramallah for distribution. So I want to make sure that everyone understands in the conversation, because especially in Western media we hear differing accounts of the situation, but almost every international entity, including the UN Security Council, General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, still recognize the West Bank and Gaza as occupied. And thus Israel has, as the occupying power, a duty to account for Palestinian health. Some people will say, well, the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s, they meant to establish a sovereign government, so the PA is fully responsible. And the PA has done routine vaccinations for polio, for measles, for rubella, all these vaccinations that children around the world usually get, has been doing those quite successfully for 25 years. However, the Oslo Accords were not written with a pandemic in mind. They were written to produce an autonomous Palestinian state within 5 years. It's now been 25 years, and that has not happened. So I believe it's quite disingenuous to point to the Oslo Accords, much of which has not been fulfilled in ways that would give Palestinians autonomy, and say, well, now on vaccines, the Palestinians, they have to deal with this on their own. Again, nothing enters Palestinian land without Israel's no and approval. So a couple issues I wanted to touch on. The situation today is quite poor. The Ministry of Health says that community transmission is responsible for 60 to 70% of cases. You're seeing less mask compliance. We're seeing this around the world because people are getting tired of the pandemic. They're tired of wearing masks. They're tired of staying home. Unfortunately, when you're in a state under conflict and occupation and siege, you don't have the flexibility to, deal with things as you might in a sovereign country. In the West Bank specifically, they identified the epicenter of the virus in Hebron. Hebron is one of the largest governorates in the West Bank, and it's known for having extremely large families and family gatherings. And so it's thought that is why Hebron alone, just that area, has 30,000 cases. So in the Gaza Strip, I believe total there was 50,000. And then in just Hebron, which is just one of the parts of the West Bank, there was 30,000. And Hebron also has a large area of Palestinians that labor in Israel. Up to 70% of Israel's construction workforce are Palestinians. So these are Palestinians that live in the West Bank and cross into Israel daily. So that is a real point of transmission for Palestinians. You also have Israeli settlers and soldiers entering the West Bank constantly. You still had home demolitions throughout the West Bank. Even in the summer, as COVID was happening, you have Israeli soldiers manning the checkpoints, interacting with Palestinians, raiding homes. There were accounts from Palestinians that Israeli soldiers were entering their homes without masks. So that was obviously a point of transmission. Some of the first cases in the West Bank identified that were not tourist related were from the families of Palestinian laborers who had been to Israel. It's thought that they contracted the virus in their work conditions in Israel and then brought it back to the West Bank. So there is no disconnection between the two populations. There is integration economically, socially. And then, of course, you have the Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, which is technically part of the West Bank, but was annexed by Israel. And so you might have a sister who lives in East Jerusalem. If you live in, let's say, Jericho, you may not be able to visit her in East Jerusalem because you don't have the permit, but she can come visit you. So if she's interacting with Israelis and Palestinians and tourists, and then she's coming into the West Bank, that's another area of transmission. Another issue with East Jerusalem is because the Palestinian Authority is not permitted really to administer services there, it's also not well administered by Israel. So it's kind of this no man's land. And you saw at some points locals were trying to put up testing clinics. They were trying to set up citizen manned checkpoints in order to stop movement. And Israel blocked and restricted all of those efforts. They also were very slow in providing Arabic language information about COVID in Arab areas within Israel and also within East Jerusalem. So it's not just that the occupation and blockade makes it difficult for Palestinians to deal with the virus, but Israeli efforts were actively making it harder for Palestinians who were trying to make efforts to build clinics again and to do these kinds of actions. In terms of vaccinations, this has been very conflicting. I'm sure we'll get some questions on this, but from my understanding thus far, there's only been about 100 vaccines provided to the Palestinian Authority from Israel. Meanwhile, Israel, I believe, has vaccinated about 25 maybe 30% of its population at this point. They're being widely lauded for their vaccination efforts. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority has been trying to procure vaccines from Russia. I believe Russia did donate a shipment expected maybe this week, if it hasn't arrived already. What's interesting about this is Palestinian human rights groups are complaining that, okay, if we are going to follow the Oslo Accords, technically Palestinians are not supposed to be able to use vaccines that Israel has not approved for its own population. And Israel has not approved the Russian vaccine, or had not approved of it, to my knowledge, up to this point. So it's also strange legal territory for the Palestinians to be receiving the Russian vaccine. The PA is also working with COVAX, which is the World Health Organization COVID vaccine distribution for low middle income countries. From what I heard, they've also been in talks with the other vaccine manufacturers, AstraZeneca, Moderna. But again, even if the Palestinian Authority can pay for, distribute, even if they could take on the entire vaccination effort, the vaccines still have to be approved by Israel to enter the West Bank. And to be honest, I have not heard how this is going to translate to Gaza, because Gaza requires even extra permissions directly from the Prime Minister of Israel's office for materials to enter the Gaza Strip. So perhaps my colleagues from Gaza have more information about that. I just want to end with the point that I really think that what COVID has done is provided a window into a situation that Palestinians have been experiencing, I mean, at least for 50 years, since the beginning of the occupation in 1967, and the beginning of the blockade in Gaza in the early 2000s, but really for the past century, under first British rule, and then, or rather Ottoman rule, and then British rule, and then Jordanian and Egyptian, and then finally Israeli control. Palestinians have never had really in the last century an autonomous governance structure that is able to respond to social needs. The Palestinian Authority has been very good at security, policing, militarizing, monitoring, even repressing and oppressing their own population. And that's also the case, in the Gaza Strip. However, when it comes to social issues, when it comes to public health, building hospitals, importing, devices to help screen for cancer, bringing in, more ventilators, nothing is easy in the Palestinian territories. Even the most straightforward life-saving equipment is difficult to bring in. So I think with COVID, because everyone on earth is experiencing the same thing, it's on everybody's mind, whether you're rich, poor, whether you're in the US, in the Gaza Strip, everybody knows about COVID. So my hope is that events like this and solidarity, international solidarity from people who understand how dangerous and harmful this virus is, say it does not make sense that this population has been essentially controlled by external entities for 50 years. Now they're facing a virus that has tested the most developed high-income countries. I mean, look at the UK, look at the US, around the world, the richest countries are struggling. So to now point to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which have been under, terrible economic, social, political circumstances, represented by governments that have not had elections in more than a decade, completely, in some areas of the international community maligned and dehumanized as simply terrorists. And so all of these things in the auspices of security, the wall, the blockade, the checkpoints, the permit system, it's all justified under the understanding that, this is for Israel's protection, and so anything is justified. I really hope that COVID helps, pop that bubble and shows us that these are human beings, civilian populations. They deserve the same access to healthcare and human rights as all populations around the world. And I'll end there.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's a good point. We're all in the same boat, but we have quite different situations that we live in anyway, with thinking about what kind of services we get and stuff. So maybe hopefully, as you say, this will make people see that everyone's the same, or should be the same at least. Exactly. I just have a very quick question, and then we'll move on to Mats. But because there's one thing that I think is just I'm struggling with, and this is the point you're making about how intertwined the lives of Palestinians and Israelis are, for the workers, the Palestinian workers going to the West, to Israel, and so why then make it so difficult? Because in the end, they're kicking themselves in the shin, right?
I agree with you. And that's why I think from a social justice lens, it's indefensible. However, I can't speak for what's happening in Norway, but even in the United States, you're seeing minority communities that are hardest hit by COVID have the least access to the vaccine. And yet these are the populations that are making our food, working in our hospitals, working in our schools. So these are essential workers, and as Palestinians are essential workers in Israel, and yet they are not prioritized, to put it diplomatically. And I can't answer as to why, but I would say that for anyone who's been watching that region over the past 50 years, this is not the first time that has been the case. It's really about the value of some lives over the value of others. I don't know how else you can see it.
No, I agree totally. Okay, well, thank you very much, Yara. I'll bring you out, and I'll bring Mats in, and then in the end, we'll bring everyone in for a discussion. But thank you very much for your insights. Okay, so finally, the last speaker today is Mads Gilbert, and I think you will raise this, or maybe sum up some of the things that they mentioned, and give us some of your insights towards the whole situation. So, looking forward to hearing you, Mats.
Yeah, thank you, Morten. And first of all, I want to thank Dr. Ahmed and Dr. Yara and Dr. Anas for very sharp, insightful, and extremely valuable presentations. Actually, I could just cancel my talk because you have said most of what I wanted to say, of course, as usual. And your insight is evidently much deeper and much more felt than whoever of us coming from Norway going on solidarity missions to Palestine can ever experience. And I'd like to sort of follow up on what Dr. Yara said by the end of her presentation, that it is obvious that the value of some lives are greater than the value of others. And, that's a very diplomatic way to formulate what we otherwise would call apartheid, that, that some people are treated in an inferior way, worse than others. And in Palestine, in occupied Palestine, this is very evident as a systematic problem. Now I will use some slides to introduce my presentation. And Morten, can you all see this now? I will talk about the structural violence in the time of the COVID pandemic. And I guess if you can't see the slide, Morten will alarm me. This is a map of Gaza, obviously. I'll come back to that because that map is actually extremely interesting when we talk about structural violence. I'll talk a little bit about people I've met in Gaza during the 25 years I've been working there. And I will, of course, also say a little bit about the pandemic, not so much. This is the graph showing the number of COVID-19 cases in Gaza from September 2020 until the other day. And it would look like any other pandemic curve in any other country, like Norway. But as all the three previous speakers have pointed to, the backdrop, the preconditions, the ramifications to handle this pandemic in the West Bank and in Gaza is extremely different from what we have in Norway. We are so used to having water in the tap, and we can shower every day. We have food in the fridge. We can walk anywhere without our passport. We're never attacked. We're never stopped at a checkpoint. We're never arrested. So for us to understand how it is to handle this situation in a situation of siege and occupation, it's almost impossible. So I'll try to give you some glimpses Now, this obviously is a map of Gaza. It's a very small piece of land, as you know, with the border to Egypt down here. And the only entry and exit point is Erez, functionally. The siege is affecting the food basket because the fishermen cannot go out fishing, as you know. And 2 million people are crammed into this small piece of land with very difficult living conditions and very difficult structural conditions for the healthcare system. This is a quote that I love. This is from a respected doctor, Dr. Asad al-Ramlawi, who I met during a meeting in Paris in 2017. And he gave a speech at the meeting where we all were presenting studies from Gaza. And he said, the most important health issue in Palestine is the occupation. And I think that's a very precise way to sum up the structural consequences of the occupation with how that affects the health and the structural situation. This is Amal. We just received her in Shifa. It's January 2009. She's one of the thousands and thousands of Palestinian children who have been bombed, injured, losing their parents, losing their habitat, their schools, and still are living in Gaza. And they are the ones who are now threatened by the pandemic. She has just arrived to Shifa. We are tending to her. She's almost unconscious after having been buried in the rubble of her bombed home for more than 3 days. She survives. This is later in 2009 when I met her, when I came back. And I've been following Amal and her family through the years that has passed. She has grown into being a very beautiful young girl. She has shrapnels in her head from the Israeli bombing that we cannot remove. She has a constant headache and nose bleeding, but she has managed to be one of the best in her class. And she has developed into a beautiful young woman who is now married and is about to have her second child. She's just one face of the structural violence that the Palestinian people are living under in West Bank and in Gaza, and the face of the more than 1.2 million children living in Gaza under still the siege and the threat of repetitious military attacks. So a little bit about the background and the structural violence in Gaza. Because the way that the Israelis are organizing the occupation and the siege and the oppression of the Palestinian people is hampering any attempt to handle the pandemic. In addition to the siege, the Palestinians have had 53 years of Israeli occupation. They have been refugees for 72 years. And mind you, 3 out of 4 inhabitants in Gaza are refugees, according to the UN protocols. And they have the ongoing settler colonial erasure, which is, of course, making their the sensitivity and their vulnerability to the pandemic even worse. In Gaza, as a result of the siege and the blockade, the unemployment rate is now nearly 50%. And almost 60% of the Palestinian families in Gaza are dependent on some sort of help to survive and to have food. These are all consequences and results of the siege. Now, we are concerned in Norway because we have 200,000 unemployed, which we should be. But compare that to the situation in Gaza, where almost half of the population is without work, and up to 90% of the female workforce from 18 to 26 are without work. Billions of dollars are lost as a result of the siege and the crumbling of the production in Gaza. Power cuts, as we know, are severely affecting the hospital as well as the critical infrastructure. Water supplies are scarce. 90% or more of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. And these are only some elements that describes the structural violence in Gaza and in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. By structure, jeg mener altså strukturell vold, det betyr samfunnsforhold som altså legger et grunnlag for å kunne klare å håndtere en pandemi, eller ikke kunne håndtere en pandemi. That was just a little Norwegian translation. And for Gaza, there has been 13 years of illegal siege and blockade, which has driven the healthcare system to the brink of collapse before the pandemic. So let's have a little flashback to what happened in 2014, as Anas described the different attacks during the last years from 2006, 9, 2012 and 2014. Back to this map, which shows actually, this is a UN map showing the number of hospitals and clinics that were bombed or destroyed by the Israeli army, the Israeli governmental army. This is a UN map, and here you see an enlarged map of Gaza, and you can see all these red dots, flashes, are damaged and closed hospitals, and damaged and open hospitals, and the primary healthcare clinics. This was a systematic attack on the healthcare system, and WHO reported that more than half of the hospitals in Gaza, 17, more than 60% of the primary healthcare clinics, 58, were damaged from broken windows to total destruction by the Israeli bombing of the healthcare system. And I will not have time to go into the number of ambulances, paramedics, and medical staff who were injured and killed as a result of Israeli bombing. One hospital, seen here, and 7 clinics were completely destroyed by the bombing. And ironically, the one hospital completely destroyed was Mustashfa al-Wafa, which was the most modern rehabilitation hospital in Gaza. Nobody held accountable. And of course, the reconstruction of the healthcare system has been extremely painful and difficult to achieve because of the blockade. And in this situation, with the siege for 17 years, with the repetitious attacks and the destruction of healthcare, with the structural violence and the lack of equipment, disposables, water, food, security, the Palestinian healthcare workers never give up. So I always pay tribute to the real heroes, who are the people of Gaza and of the West Bank, and their medical staff. It's not the expats. It's not we who are lucky enough to go there and to go home when we need to go home, but it is these people. Dr. Sobi Skaik, who was the head of Shifa Hospital for many years, Dr. Sarah Al-Sakka, who is the first female surgical resident in Gaza, Dr. Marwan, brilliant chief of surgery and the head triage officer during the attacks. This is in Shifa during one of the few lulls in the bombing in the middle of the night in July 24 during the Israeli attack. Now, these people are the same people who now have to handle the patients coming in with severe pneumonia, severe breathing difficulties, who needs ICU support, and who are handled by Dr. Ahmed, the nurses, and the other doctors in a fantastic way. This is one of my friends. He's a paramedic. He is one of those who are going home to people to pick them up when they have COVID. This picture I took in July 2018. He's on call, close to the border. He was hit by the Israeli snipers when he was handling injured during the Great March of Return. And he had to have an external fixation on his very complicated fracture. He doesn't stay home. He goes back to work with his injury to serve his people. Those are the real heroes. And these are the young Palestinian people protesting the siege at the border during the Great March of Return, losing their lives, losing their extremities, their legs, their arms, but going back to protest the injustice of the occupation. This is the reality. This is the backdrop. This is the living conditions for the 2 million people in Gaza. And they don't give up. These are young medical students at Al-Azhar University in Gaza City, training life-saving first aid. Not only training themselves to be good at it, but going out in the community. These are young medical students going out to train school kids, students, local people, how to stop a bleeding, how to resuscitate, how to do CPR, in order to encourage them to be in control when there is an emergency situation or a new attack, and to increase the resilience of the people in this situation. And this fantastic, it's called in Arabic, it's called sumud. It means the willingness not to give up, the resilience. It is everywhere in Gaza. And I think it's a collective immunity in many ways that in the beginning, at least, was an important factor to combat the pandemic. And they do research. This is one of many research papers from the medical students in Gaza during siege, doing research on how to improve the training of the local people, using medical students as instructors. I'm just showing this because far too often the Palestinian people are portrayed and described as helpless and victims. And the victimhood of the Palestinian is part of the way that they are kept oppressed and kept idle in the situation. I've been fortunate to work with Anas, with Nashwa Skeik here, a brilliant Palestinian doctor now working for WHO in Gaza, and these young medical staffers like Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Anas, and Dr. Yara are the backbone of the healthcare system. So this is, in my point of view, not a difficult conflict. It's far too often, also when we discuss the pandemic, the vaccination, how should we deal with this? You know, Norwegian politicians will say, oh, this is such a difficult conflict. No, it is not a difficult conflict. We have to sanitize our language. This is a difficult occupation. And that's a totally different thing because it's unjust, it's against international law, it's against humanitarian law. And as it was pointed out in the previous presentations, Israel as the occupier has the duty to ensure the safety and the healthcare for the occupied population, including the population in Gaza and including the vaccination. So the situation today, this is from the brilliant daily reports from the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza. Here you see a map of Gaza. This is the report from January 24th, and it is a very detailed description of the number of positive COVID patients in every single governorate of Gaza and every single municipality. These are the total counts broken down on the different zones in Gaza, and this is the graph that I'll just put a few words on to conclude my presentation. This graph shows the number of severe COVID cases, the red bars, day by day from the 20th of December, just before Christmas, until yesterday. And it is a promising development. You can see that the severe cases are diminishing, they are decreasing. The gray bars here, the top one, are the critical ones, the ones that end up in Gaza European Hospital with Dr. Ahmed and his colleagues in the ICU. Also, that number is pretty stable, but it is primarily the severe cases that are diminishing. And also, if you look at the number of new cases per day who are tested positive, this is from the 1st of January until the 23rd of January. It started at 700 per day, 600, 500, and now it's down to around 250, 200 per day. You might imagine that there is a decreasing trend if this is a reduced testing capacity or if it is a real reduction in the number of positive cases. I guess Dr. Ahmed can answer that better than me. And this is the positivity rate, which has been very high among those who has been tested. You see that 1 out of 4 will be positive. The capacity for testing in Gaza is only 2,000 tests per day because of the siege, so we really don't know what the situation is. But it's been a high number, and it all came after August when the first cases came into Gaza. So to conclude, this situation in Gaza, the lack of vaccination, the lack of capacity in the hospital system, and the lack of testing capacity, it's all part of the structural violence, and it's all part of the occupation of Palestine. But they don't give up. This is the twin Amal that I told you about, and Abdallah in Gaza, in Zaytun, where they still are living under siege and occupation. They are, of course, also risking to have the COVID-19. This is Jumana, who lost her father and her uncle during the attack in 2014, growing up to be a beautiful young schoolgirl, but always remembering the horrors of the 2014 attack and still missing 3 fingers on her left hand from the Israeli bombing of her house. These are the people who are now trying to survive the pandemic, and I think we owe them our respect and solidarity, and I think we can all do our share of solidarity here from Norway. Shukran jazilan, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mats. I just want to ask you, because obviously, I think one of the things that we end up with after getting all this information from Ahmed, from Anas, from Yara, from you, is a feeling of we want to do something. We want to try to make a change. So, and I think I'll bring everyone in for this as maybe a discussion topic, and like what can we do as a hang on, I have to find Yara. Aha, there we go. So what can we do in Norway? I mean, because it can feel a bit futile almost, sitting here and do you have any perspective on this, Mats?
Well, yeah. I what I always say when people ask me, oh, can I go with you to Gaza? No, I'm not running a tourist office. If you go, you have to have a purpose and you have to be invited, number one. The most important thing that we do as Norwegians is what we do at home. It's not what we do in Gaza. That's why I show you the pictures of all these brilliant healthcare people, the young medical students, the resilient population. They manage. They don't need us. But we can go there. We can learn from them. We can tell the stories which they are denied access to tell. We can do research with them. But what we do when we come home to change the opinion in Norway so that we can change the government of Norway, so that they can put pressure on the US and on Israel to lift the siege, to treat the Palestinians as equal human beings, that's our job. And everyone attending this webinar, every one of you all over Norway, you can do your share in the union, at home, with your neighbors, in the school. You can write in the paper, be outraged and see yourself as a power of change, because we need to change the Norwegian attitude. That's what is our, most promising duty. And if you look at the opinion of the Norwegian people, it has changed dramatically. Norway used to be the most pro-Zionist country in Europe after the Second World War. And now we're maybe one of the most pro-Palestinian countries in Norway, in Europe. So, the drip is hollowing the stone and we have to be patient. And I think one thing that I'm very preoccupied with is what I call evidence-based solidarity, that we base our solidarity on true evidence, that we do research, we find the numbers, we can describe the reality, because it is at the end of the day the reality that is the hardest argument. So if anybody doubts me, I say, don't listen to me, go there, see for yourself, and you'll come back changed. Thank you. But maybe Yara and Ahmed and Anas will comment on that.
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah, I want to echo exactly what he said at the beginning, Mads, in his presentation, which is that I think that globally, populations have to push back against this narrative that this is intractable, that this is too complicated, that this is complex. Sometimes I hear, oh, well, they've been fighting for centuries, how we can't stop it now. And I really think that I think all Palestinians have to believe that when the facts are presented, it's very hard to argue that it has to be this way. I can't, and I mean, yes, for anyone who can visit primarily the West Bank, because it's very difficult to get into Gaza, I would encourage you to go, and not just to Ramallah or Bethlehem, but go into, the other parts, see the checkpoints. Imagine this being your everyday life. Imagine the most frustrating part of your day, trying to call customer service or trying to buy a plane ticket or something basic. And then imagine that applied to every aspect of your life every single day. And that is life for Palestinians. And, again, I there's a lot of tour guides in the West Bank, and they'll say, when tourists ask me, oh, what can I do? The tour guide will say, your work is at home, wherever you're from. Lobby your government, send letters, sign petitions. I mean, I think for now, the priority is getting Palestinians vaccinated. I believe there are some global petitions to encourage Israel to more openly provide vaccines and cooperate with the Palestinian Authority on this. But in general, this is not an unsolvable problem. It's a man-made problem. It's justified by, very tricky religious and security arguments that we have been told cannot be questioned. And I think that, I believe that if you look at the facts, they can absolutely be questioned and challenged, and everybody deserves human rights. Everybody deserves a right to health and standard care, basic living. And it's just not fair to say to 5 million people, wait another 5 or 10 years. You know, we have to worry about Syria now. We have to worry about Yemen now. We have all these other situations going on. I don't, you know, we can do all of these things at once by advocating for just basic humanity. And if you can do that in your local, federal, international, you know, forms of government and representation, I think that would be doing a lot of good.
Ahmed, do you have a comment to this?
No.
I think for me, like for us, for the Palestinians, especially living in Gaza, you know, because of the siege, we obviously have the majority of the people who cannot go out. But with the internet access, at least that we have, when we hear stories or when we hear headlines that support the Palestinians, we kind of feel that people are knowing about what's happening. We're not left alone. We're not left just to the siege and the occupation. This, at least in the least form, it gives us some sort of support, some sort of brotherhood, some sort of solidarity, that we feel that we're not just struggling alone out in the dark and nobody knows about us. So at least do that. At least this feeling is sometimes I could say that sometimes it fuels our steadfastness, our sumud, our ability to be resilient against all forms of injustice and oppression that we have. And as Yara and Dr. Mads have described the situation, but for me, like when you look at the situation, it's not just a stationary situation. It's moving, but unfortunately, it's moving in the wrong direction. It's moving towards more oppression, more injustice, more tighter occupation. So what we should do is highlight these facts, highlight that the population is not, you're not just sitting there and just waiting for the situation to get better, but instead the situation is getting worse. So at least stop it from getting worse. Fight to make it better. Fight to make the Palestinian life better. How to do that? Maybe write in the journal, write in the newspaper, lobby your at the city level, the regional level, the national level, because it all makes a change at the end. Just a little by little, drop by drop, it all makes a change. Just like the BDS movement, even though it starts as very civil, peaceful, movement, but at the end, you see that it has this kind of like tracking effect that at the end it makes a difference. And so this is, if we have more of that, more of solidarity movements, more of outspoken pro-Palestinians who show the facts on the ground, who challenge the current narrative of the Israeli occupation, and who show support to the Palestinians, then I think this is very important and very valuable to us.
Indeed, and one thing is for sure, that in these digital ages, no one can say they didn't know what was going on, because the numbers are out there and the news are telling the stories. And as I usually say, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So, I would ask anyone who's watching this to become a member of the Palestine Committee, to organize your solidarity, and that way to help us be stronger and fight to change the politics here in Norway. Yes, Mats?
Yeah, just one point, adding to what Anas just said, and also what Yara said, that I think the numbers speak for themselves, but I think also we should be more active in seeking the Palestinian sources of information, because we are too much relying on the Norwegian mainstream media. So I would suggest that the Palestina Committee, the Palestinian Committee in Norway, if you could make a really comprehensive list of all these organizations, and maybe Yara can help us with that, because there are so many extremely scholar and also very, very informative websites, from the Electronic Intifada to the different human rights organizations, and also the Israeli, like B'Tselem, because there you can have newsletters coming in every day to your mailbox, and you can sort of vaccinate yourself against the dull oppression of your brain by the mainstream media, and you can resist it, because it is, at the end of the day, the information you get, the information you're fed by the mainstream media, which will form your thoughts and your brain. So you have to be active and search other information sources, and there are so many good Palestinian ones. Number one. Number two, get organized. I totally support that. We have to get organized. And number three, don't forget we have a parliamentary election this fall in Norway. Probably we will have a change of government. Look at what happened in the US. I've been traveling, for 10 years, since 2009, I've been traveling 3-4 times a year to lecture and to speak about Gaza in the US. And I've seen the growing solidarity. Students for Justice in Palestine, the Jewish progressive movements, everything. And now the Gang of Four coming into the capital, the 4 girls, AOC and the 3 others, with a radical different stance on Palestine and the US support for Palestine. We would never have thought that would have been happening 10 years ago. So I think for us Norwegians who are supporting the Palestinian just struggle, we should take a really hard responsibility now on using this election for the new parliament to have a change of government. We now have a right-wing government, just to inform you, and to have a pro-Palestinian stance for those who are elected, and ask them, ask all the people who are going to stand for an office in the parliament, where do you stand on Palestine? And demand, I think Palestine Committee could maybe formulate some very concrete questions to make them responsible before we vote for them. Then we can change.
Great, thank you, Mats. Ahmed, your sound is a bit better now. Would you like to comment?
Yes, it's okay now. I would like, I saw a comment there asking if we are, just a moment. Last time I checked, they have own government, Hamas, isn't? So people out there think we are a real country. We having a government, and the poor infrastructure is due to corrupted governments, and that idea is worldwide. I hear it a lot, but maybe you can, and the Palestinian community in Norway can correct this idea. We don't really have a real government, a real state, a real country who can build the infrastructures and educate. We depend on donations and all under the Israeli authorities. We don't really have an independent state. So the people always blame our government, and they call the Israel attacks in 2008, 2012, and war like we are the same level of power of 2 countries conflict. But that is not the real situation. Yeah.
That's very true. Very true. No, we will do our best, Ahmed, we do this. We try to do this every day to spread information about the realities of the occupation and the blockade of Gaza, and to put the blame where blame is due. And as Mats say, this is a difficult occupation, and he's always been the words we use is important, and we will take care and make sure that we use the right words and point the blame to the right people. Yes, Mats, final word.
Final comment. I think, just to sum up this fantastic webinar, where we have 75% Palestinian voices. Great. And we're breaking the siege because we have Ahmed in Gaza. We're breaking the siege. They can't fence you in. We just take the signal across the wall and the barbed wire, and we talk. So to all of you listening, and to the Palestine Committee, why don't we make more webinars and include more Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank? Because it is like oxygen to have someone to talk with who listen to you. I know that from my many years in Gaza, how important it is have friends who call you up and you can see them. Just have a chat, talk about your everyday work and what the situation is. So could we make an effort to drill more holes in the wall around Gaza to make friendship groups on Zoom or on whatever digital platform where we can talk on the web, and commit ourselves, adopt a family or some friends or some students, and make this more of a continuous presence for the Palestinians in Gaza. I don't know what you say, Ahmed and Anas. We have a little thing we call the Marna House Cafe, where we meet on Sundays and we chat. And then it's always a little bit, small talk, and then a lot of politics, of course, but it is refreshing, and it's an important way to keep the resistance going, the sumud. Thank you.
That's a good suggestion, and we will definitely keep that in mind and see what we can do about organizing something like that. Definitely. Okay, so I would like to thank you all very, very much for sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us, and for educating us on the situation. I'm sure I speak for all of us who's been watching today that it's been very, very interesting, and this video will be available online for everyone. So even if people couldn't watch it today, they will be able to watch it later. And it's been very valuable for us to hear your inputs and your knowledge. So thank you, shukran, very much. And I hope that the downward spiraling trends will continue, and one day, inshallah, the Palestine will be free, and we can come and meet in person and enjoy a delightful cup of Arabic coffee or tea. So thank you very much, and that concludes this monthly meeting. I'll just say a few words in Norwegian in the end, or I can say it in English. I'll say it in English. Next month we will have a new meeting. This will be posted on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. Please spread this meeting to all your friends. Like us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and please become a member of the Palestine Committee today and be part of the solidarity movement for Palestine. So with that, thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye, thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye, thank you for organizing this.
Assalam, shukran jazilan, kuluna Gaza.